The room was silent, not the calm silence of peace, but the kind that follows a sentence no one wants to say out loud. Outside. Winter pressed down on Europe with merciless weight. Inside Allied headquarters, time felt frozen, as if the war itself were holding its breath. A single map dominated the wall. Red lines cut through blue like open wounds. At its center was a small town circled in pencil, unremarkable on paper, yet now carrying the lives of thousands. An airborne division was surrounded, no retreat, no resupply, no certainty they would see another sunrise. General Arthur Hale stood alone beneath the dim lights, his coat still on, his gloves still in his hands. He had not removed them in hours. Coffee sat untouched on the table, gone cold long ago. Reports lay stacked beside it, each one confirming what he already knew. Ammunition nearly gone, wounded piling up, the enemy tightening the noose by the hour. This was not a battle slipping away. This was annihilation approaching with a clock. Hale checked his watch. The ticking was loud now. Every second sounded like a verdict. He understood something few men ever truly face, that leadership is not about issuing orders when victory is possible, but about choosing when failure seems inevitable. Somewhere, far away, soldiers he would never meet were still fighting, still believing someone would come. They did not know how close the decision was, or how fragile their hope had become. History often remembers explosions, speeches, and triumphs. It rarely remembers the silence before them, the moment when one man realizes that if he chooses wrong, 10,000 lives will vanish into footnotes. That was the silence Arthur Hale stood in. If this opening already has you leaning closer, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Your support is what allows us to keep bringing you stories about impossible decisions, battlefield leadership, and the moments that changed history forever. Before we continue, here's a quick question for you. At this moment, do you think Hale should risk everything on one unpredictable general? A. Yes, bold leadership demands bold trust. B. No, the risk is too great. Comment A or B below, and let's see how you would decide when the clock is running out. By the fourth night, the men of the 82nd Skyborne Regiment had stopped counting the hours. Time inside the encircled town of Innsbruck no longer moved forward, it simply pressed down. Snow filled the streets, muting sound, swallowing footsteps, and turning every ruined building into a frozen shelter or a shallow grave. They were cut off from everything except one another. Ammunition was counted round by round, rifles were passed carefully, never set down carelessly. Medics worked without rest, hands raw from cold and blood, improvising splints from shattered doors and torn packs. There was no room left in the cellars, so the wounded lay shoulder to shoulder, breathing clouds of steam into the darkness. No one complained. Complaints wasted oxygen. What kept the division alive was not supply or strategy, it was refusal. Refusal to panic, refusal to surrender, refusal to disappear quietly just because the map said they should be gone. Leadership here did not come from rank alone. It came from sergeants who stayed calm when artillery shook the walls. From lieutenants who walked the perimeter in full view of enemy fire because someone had to be seen standing. From medics who whispered reassurances they weren't sure were true. Courage became routine, and routine became survival. At night, when the shelling paused, men spoke softly about home, not in speeches, just fragments. A fishing trip in Michigan, a diner in Ohio, a wife who laughed too loudly, a son who had just learned to walk. These memories were not escapes, they were anchors. They reminded the men why holding mattered, even if no one came. When the enemy demanded surrender, the response was brief and deliberate. Not defiant for show, defiant because it was the only honest answer left. Surrender meant erasure. Resistance meant possibility. The cold was relentless. Fingers numbed, beards froze stiff. Yet morale, against every logical prediction. Held. The men of the 82nd Skyborne did not believe themselves invincible. They believed something simpler and more dangerous, that as long as they were still fighting, the story was not finished. They did not know if General Arthur Hale had found a way. They did not know if relief was moving or stalled or impossible. What they knew was this: every hour they held was another hour borrowed for someone else to decide. And so they held, not because victory was assured, but because vanishing was unacceptable. Responsibility does not arrive with noise. It settles quietly, like weight added, one breath at a time. For General Arthur Hale, the burden of command revealed itself not in the chaos of battle, but in the still hours between reports, when there was nothing left to do but think. He stood apart from his staff now, choosing solitude over counsel. The maps had not changed, but his understanding of them had. Lines and symbols no longer represented maneuver or opportunity. They represented names he would never learn, families he would never meet, futures that depended on what he decided next. Authority had given him the power to command armies. Accountability had given him something far heavier. Hale had always believed leadership meant balance, listening carefully, weighing options, acting deliberately. But war has moments when balance becomes paralysis. Every reasonable alternative presented to him carried the same conclusion: delay. Delay until conditions improved. Delay until forces regrouped. Delay until risk could be reduced. And delay, Hale knew, was a decision in itself. He recalled earlier in his career, when caution had been praised, when patience had saved lives, this moment was different. Patience now would not preserve strength, it would consume it. Somewhere inside the ring tightening around Innsbruck, men were exhausting their last margins of endurance. They were not asking for certainty, they were asking for a chance. The loneliest truth of command struck him then. No one else could carry this weight for him. Advisors could recommend, subordinates could execute, but the moral ownership of the outcome, success or catastrophe, belonged to him alone. History would not footnote the weather or the enemy's advantage. It would attach names. Hale sat down and opened his notebook. Staring at a blank page, he began to write, then stopped. Words felt premature, almost dishonest, while the decision remained unmade. Instead, his thoughts returned to one uncomfortable realization he had resisted for days. The solution, if it existed at all, lay not in procedure, but in personality. There was a general whose methods grated against Hale's instincts, whose confidence bordered on provocation, whose presence always brought as much friction as results. Hale had spent years containing him, defending him, doubting him. Trusting him now would mean staking everything, not only the lives of the surrounded division, but Hale's own command, on a man he had never fully controlled. Hale closed the notebook. In war, he understood, leadership is not proven by avoiding risk. It is proven by choosing which risk you are willing to live with. General Marcus Caldwell was not a man built for quiet rooms or cautious conversations. He belonged to motion, to pressure, to moments where hesitation cost lives. Those who served under him learned quickly that comfort was not part of his vocabulary. Those who served above him learned something else, that brilliance often arrives wrapped in friction. Caldwell's reputation had been earned the hard way. He demanded speed when others demanded consensus. He pushed units past exhaustion because he understood something most commanders preferred not to admit. The enemy never waits for permission. His critics called him reckless. His supporters called him honest. Both were partly right. What separated Caldwell from mere aggressiveness was preparation. While others reacted, he anticipated. Long before the crisis tightened around Innsbruck, Caldwell had been studying roads, weather patterns, and logistical limits, not because he had been ordered to, but because war punished those who waited to be asked. His headquarters near Lyon was cluttered with maps layered upon maps, arrows drawn lightly in pencil, ready to be erased and redrawn. He planned not because he enjoyed certainty, but because he respected uncertainty. To his men, Caldwell was relentless but transparent. He never promised safety, he promised effort. He walked command posts in the cold without ceremony, asked direct questions, and accepted responsibility when plans failed. That consistency forged trust far deeper than charm ever could. Soldiers followed him not because they liked him, but because he never pretended the job was easier than it was. To General Arthur Hale, Caldwell was a contradiction that refused to resolve. Hale valued discipline and cohesion. Caldwell thrived on controlled chaos. Hale sought order. Caldwell created momentum. Their interactions over the years had been marked by tension, arguments behind closed doors, compromises that satisfied no one completely. Hale had often wondered whether Caldwell's results justified the constant strain he placed on the command structure, yet in moments when progress seemed impossible, Caldwell delivered. He was a general who made people uncomfortable because he forced decisions into the open. He did not hide behind process or defer responsibility upward. When confronted with uncertainty, he chose direction. That quality, dangerous in the wrong moment, became invaluable in the right one. Now, as the crisis deepened, Caldwell sensed the shift in the air before the call ever came. War had taught him to recognize that moment, the instant when preparation meets necessity. He did not celebrate it. He simply adjusted his plans, knowing that if the order arrived, there would be no room for hesitation. Caldwell understood the price of failure. He accepted it anyway, because for men like him, leadership was not about being agreeable. It was about being decisive when others could not. The meeting was convened without ceremony, as if formality itself had become a luxury no one could afford. Senior commanders gathered around the long table, coats still dusted with snow, eyes hollowed by days without rest. Maps were unrolled, reports stacked, calculations murmured under breath. Every man in the room understood the unspoken truth. They were not here to debate theory. They were here because time had run out. General Arthur Hale stood at the head of the table, listening. One by one, the assessments came. Roads were compromised, weather unpredictable, units already engaged. Each explanation was sound, professional, and cautious. Each ended in the same conclusion: delay. Not refusal, not surrender, but postponement dressed in reason. Hale felt the weight of every word. Yet none of them answered the question he carried into the room. When General Marcus Caldwell finally spoke, the room grew still. He did not raise his voice. He did not argue. He simply stated what he could do, not what he hoped might be possible. He named a date, a direction, a force. The precision of his answer cut through the uncertainty like a blade. Silence followed. Not disbelief alone, but recognition. Everyone understood what Caldwell was proposing. To disengage from active operations, pivot an entire force across hostile terrain, and strike through winter conditions in less than 3 days was not boldness. It was a wager against physics, logistics, and exhaustion. Hale fixed his gaze on Caldwell. "I'm not asking for optimism," he said quietly. "I'm asking for truth. If you fail, the men in Innsbruck do not get another chance. They don't get to retreat. They don't get captured. They die." The room held its breath. Caldwell did not hesitate. "I understand." Hale leaned forward, lowering his voice further, stripping rank from the moment. "If you give me your word, and you're wrong, this ends your command. Not reassignment, not reprimand. It ends here." This was not a threat. It was clarity. Caldwell nodded once. He had already measured the cost. What mattered to him was not the consequence to his career, but the consequence of inaction. He had learned long ago that in war, certainty is rare, but responsibility is absolute. "I'll be there," he said, "not because it's likely, because it's necessary." In that instant, Hale made his decision. Trust, he realized, is not built on comfort. It is built on preparation, honesty, and the willingness to stand by a promise when everything depends on it. By accepting Caldwell's answer, Hale was not choosing recklessness. He was choosing commitment. And with that choice, the course of the campaign shifted, not with applause or reassurance, but with a single, irrevocable agreement between two men who understood exactly what was at stake. Once the orders were issued and the first columns moved, the war entered its most unforgiving phase, not action, but waiting for General Arthur Hale. This was the hardest part. Command had given him the power to set events in motion. It did not grant him the power to control their outcome. Each hour brought new reports from General Marcus Caldwell's advancing forces. Progress measured in miles, then in fractions of miles, roads choked with snow and wreckage, bridges damaged or destroyed, enemy resistance stiffening, as if sensing the race against time. Caldwell was moving, but the clock was faster. At the same time, messages from Innsbruck grew shorter, not because conditions improved, but because there was less left to say. Ammunition was nearly gone. Casualties mounted. Positions held in the morning were lost by nightfall. Yet the men of the 82nd Skyborne Regiment continued to report the same final line. Perimeter intact. For now. Haley read every update personally. He stopped delegating them to aides. Each report felt like a personal reckoning. He traced Caldwell's advance on the map with a pencil worn smooth, measuring distances that seemed to shrink and expand with cruel unpredictability. There were moments when relief felt close enough to touch, followed by hours when it seemed impossibly far away. Sleep became impossible. Hale lay awake, replaying the decision he had made, testing it against every outcome. If Caldwell broke through too late, history would not debate whether the choice had been reasonable. It would record that Hale had trusted, and that trust had failed. One night, Haley began drafting letters he prayed he would never send. Not official communiques, but personal notes, words meant for families who believed their sons were still alive. He wrote slowly, choosing phrases that acknowledged sacrifice without explaining loss. Halfway through the first letter, he stopped. The pen hovered uselessly in his hand. He folded the paper and set it aside. Unfinished. The waiting was not passive. It was a constant negotiation with fear. Hale listened for weather reports as if they were oracles. When clouds finally lifted enough for limited resupply drops, the relief was brief and fragile. It bought time, nothing more. Every man involved understood the truth. No one spoke aloud. If Caldwell did not arrive soon, courage would no longer be enough. As the hours stretched on, Hale returned again and again to the same thought, not as hope, but as resolve. He had chosen action over hesitation. Now all that remained was to stand by that choice, accept whatever came with it, and bear witness to the price of leadership when men were still fighting somewhere beyond the reach of command. The phone rang in the late afternoon, cutting through the headquarters like a sudden crack of ice. For a fraction of a second, no one moved. General Arthur Hale was standing near the map table, staring at a narrow stretch of road marked in pencil, its significance growing heavier with every passing hour. He did not look at the phone immediately. He already knew what it represented. An aide answered, listened, and went pale. "Sir," he said quietly, "it's General Marcus Caldwell." Hale took the receiver with both hands. The room around him seemed to recede, the murmured activity of staff officers dissolving into silence. For days, he had imagined this moment, imagined the words he might hear, or the words he might never hear at all. "Arthur," Caldwell said, his voice rough with exhaustion and cold. "We're through." Hale did not respond. He had learned not to trust first reports. Too much had balanced on assumptions already. His grip tightened. "Say it again." "We made contact at 1650. Fourth elements broke the line. The corridor's narrow, but it's open. Supplies are moving now. The men are alive." For a long moment, Hale said nothing. His shoulders sagged as if a physical weight had been lifted from them. He lowered himself into a chair he hadn't noticed was there, pressing his free hand against the table to steady himself. The map in front of him blurred. "Thank God," he said finally, the words escaping before rank or composure could restrain them. "You did it." On the other end of the line, Caldwell paused. He had never been comfortable with praise, especially when it threatened to overshadow the men who had paid for progress with blood and exhaustion. "They held," he replied. "We just reached them." That was when Hale felt it, the realization of how close the line had been. Hours, perhaps less. Another delay, another setback, and courage alone would not have been enough. 10,000 men would have vanished, not because they lacked resolve, but because time had finally run out. Hale closed his eyes briefly, breathing in the stillness that followed the call. When he looked up, staff officers were watching him closely. They saw something they rarely saw in their commander, emotion unfiltered by protocol. "The division is relieved," Hale said. His voice was steady now, but softer. "They're alive." The room exhaled. After the call ended, Hale remained seated, staring once more at the map. The thin pencil line marking the corridor to Innsbruck looked insignificant, almost fragile. Yet it represented something immeasurable, lives saved, faith justified, and a decision that would echo long after the guns fell silent. In that moment, Hale understood that leadership is not remembered for the orders given, but for the lives preserved when everything hangs by a single phone call. In the days that followed the relief of Innsbruck, the noise of war slowly returned to its usual rhythm: orders, movements, new objectives. Yet, for General Arthur Hale, something had shifted permanently. The crisis had passed, but its meaning lingered, demanding reflection. Victory, he knew, was more than a line pushed forward on a map. It was the quiet understanding of what had almost been lost. Hale's official statements were measured. As they always were, he spoke of coordination, speed, and determination. He praised the resilience of the 82nd Skyborne Regiment, acknowledging their refusal to yield under impossible conditions. He commended the relief forces for executing a maneuver many had believed unattainable. These words were necessary. They would enter reports, briefings, and eventually, history. But it was in private that Hale's most important words took shape. Alone in his quarters one evening, he wrote to General Marcus Caldwell. The letter was brief, lacking ornament or flourish. Hale was not a sentimental man, and Caldwell was not one who welcomed sentiment. Yet the meaning was unmistakable. Hale wrote that Caldwell had given his word when uncertainty ruled, and had kept it when failure would have been easier to explain than success. He wrote that lives had been saved not by chance, but by resolve. Most importantly, Hale acknowledged something he had resisted admitting for years, that Caldwell's difficult nature was inseparable from the qualities that made him indispensable. The impatience, the relentless drive, the refusal to accept limitations were not flaws to be managed away. They were the very traits that had carried an army through winter, through resistance, through doubt, and into history. In conversations with his closest advisers, Hale was even more candid. He admitted how close he had come to choosing caution instead of commitment, how easy it would have been to justify delay, how devastating that choice would have been. Trusting Caldwell, he said, had been the most agonizing decision of his command, and the most necessary. Years later, when Hale was asked about the defining moments of the war, he did not begin with battles or strategies. He spoke instead of trust, of the burden of choosing a man rather than a plan, of the responsibility that comes with allowing someone else to act in your name when everything is at stake. What matters, Hale reflected, is not whether a leader is easy to command. It is whether he delivers when history demands more than comfort. The words Hale spoke, publicly and privately, outlived the crisis itself. They shaped how Marcus Caldwell would be remembered, not as a convenient subordinate, but as a commander who turned preparation into salvation. They also defined Hale's own legacy, not as a man who avoided risk, but as one who understood that true leadership sometimes means trusting the most difficult person in the room to do the impossible. Those words became history because they captured a truth war never stops teaching. When everything is on the line, results are the final measure of character. When we look back at this story, what endures is not the snow, the maps, or even the battlefield itself. It is the human weight carried by the men at its center. General Arthur Hale faced the kind of decision that defines a lifetime of leadership. He did not command from safety or certainty. He stood at the edge of irreversible consequence, knowing that hesitation could quietly destroy 10,000 lives just as surely as any enemy force. His burden was not strategy alone, but ownership, the willingness to accept blame if trust failed. General Marcus Caldwell, in turn, embodied a different truth. He was not chosen because he was agreeable, polished, or easy to manage. He was chosen because when conditions collapsed and time disappeared, he had prepared for the moment others feared. His value lay not in his personality, but in his reliability under pressure. Caldwell did not promise comfort. He promised results, and he delivered them when hours separated survival from annihilation. Together, their story reveals a timeless lesson. Leadership is not about perfection, nor about avoiding risk. It is about recognizing the difference between danger and necessity. Hale learned that trust, when given to the right person, becomes a force multiplier. Caldwell proved that preparation, discipline, and decisiveness can turn impossible odds into narrow victories. For us today, this lesson extends far beyond military history. In our careers, families, and communities, we will face moments when waiting feels safer than acting, when trusting someone feels riskier than doing nothing. This story reminds us that progress rarely comes from comfort. It comes from choosing responsibility over fear and backing capable people when outcomes truly matter. The question is not whether we will face difficult decisions, but whether we will have the courage to make them when time is short. Now, here's a quick question for you. When everything is on the line, what matters more in leadership? A, personal character and likability. B, proven ability to deliver results under pressure. Comment A or B below. And beyond that, what do you think? How would you have decided in Arthur Hale's position? Share your perspective in the comments so others can learn from your view. If stories like this challenge how you think about leadership, responsibility, and human courage, make sure to subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us continue bringing you powerful, meaningful stories that still matter today.